The winter of 1817 arrived in London with a vengeance, bringing snow that blanketed the cobblestones and frost that painted intricate patterns upon the window panes of every grand townhouse along Mayfair. The Thames itself seemed to slow in its ancient course, as if the very lifeblood of the city had thickened beneath the weight of the cold. Yet no chill born of nature could compare to the desolation that had settled in Lady Seraphina Alderbury's heart 3 years prior, when news arrived that Magnus Hale de Thornridge, the formidable Duke of Thornridge, had fallen in battle along the Spanish frontier. The entire kingdom mourned him. The newspapers, those arbiters of public sentiment, printed elegies that spoke of his valor, his strategic brilliance, his unwavering dedication to crown and country. The Prince Regent himself attended a memorial service at Westminster Abbey, where the Archbishop delivered a sermon, praising the fallen Duke's service. The pews were filled with lords and ladies, generals and politicians, all come to pay their respects to a man who had died too young, too far from home. And Seraphina, who had loved him with every fibre of her being, who had given him her heart in secret during stolen moments in moonlit gardens, wore black for a full year. She ignored the whispers that followed her through ballrooms and drawing rooms, the speculation that she had no right to mourn a man who had never formally claimed her, who had left no public declaration of his intentions. Let them whisper, she thought. Let them judge. They knew nothing of what she and Magnus had shared, but mourning was all she had left. Mourning and memories. She remembered the last time she had seen Magnus with painful clarity. It was etched into her mind like a portrait painted in indelible ink, every detail preserved with crystalline precision. The afternoon had been golden, one of those perfect September days when summer graciously granted autumn a reprieve before surrendering to its inevitable advance. They had met in the gardens of his estate, Thornridge Hall, in a secluded grove where ancient oaks stood sentinel and roses bloomed in wild profusion. Magnus had been restless that day, she recalled. He had paced as he spoke, his tall frame moving with the controlled energy of a man accustomed to action, uncomfortable with stillness. His dark hair had caught the sunlight, and his grey eyes, those remarkable eyes that could shift from storm cloud intensity to tender warmth in an instant, had been serious as he took her hands in his. "The war goes poorly," he had told her, his voice low and urgent. "Wellington needs every able-bodied man. I've received orders to join the campaign in Spain within the fortnight." Seraphina's breath had caught. She had known this was coming. For weeks, rumours of mobilization had swept through London's drawing rooms, but knowing and experiencing the reality were entirely different matters. "How long?" she had managed to ask, though her throat felt tight. "As long as it takes to drive Bonaparte's forces from the peninsula," Magnus had replied. Then his grip on her hands had tightened, becoming almost painful in its intensity. "But Seraphina, hear me well. When I return, and I will return, I shall speak to your father immediately. There will be no more secrecy, no more stolen moments in shadowed alcoves and hidden gardens. I will make my intentions known to all of London. I will make you my Duchess, and we will build the life we've spoken of in whispers. Children, a home filled with love and laughter, a future." Tears had blurred her vision then, as they did now in the remembering. "Promise me you'll come back," she had whispered, her voice breaking. "Promise me, Magnus." He had pulled her into his arms then, holding her with a fierceness that spoke of desperation and determination in equal measure. His lips had pressed against her temple, and she had felt the rapid beat of his heart against her own. "I promise you, Seraphina," he had murmured into her hair. "On my life, on my honor, on everything I hold sacred, I promise. Wait for me. No matter what you hear, no matter what they tell you, wait for me. I will come back to you." She had waited. God help her, she had tried. For 6 long months, she had clung to hope with the tenacity of a drowning woman grasping at driftwood. She had read the dispatches from the peninsula with obsessive attention, searching for any mention of the Duke of Thornridge. She had attended every social function where military wives and mothers gathered, desperate for news of their loved ones. She had prayed every night, kneeling beside her bed until her knees ached, begging God to keep Magnus safe, to bring him home. Then, the letter arrived. Seraphina could still recall every detail of that morning. It had been April, and spring was asserting itself with determination. Daffodils bloomed in the window boxes, and the air carried the promise of renewal. She had been in the morning room, attempting to focus on her correspondence, when she heard her father's bellow of shock from his study. The Earl of Eldamont had emerged moments later, his face grave, a letter trembling in his hand. The War Office seal had been unmistakable, red wax stamped with the official insignia that struck terror into the hearts of families across the kingdom. "Serafina," he had said, and something in his tone had caused her blood to turn to ice. "My dear, you must prepare yourself. I have received grave news. The Duke of Thornridge—" The rest of his words had become a roaring in her ears. Dead, killed in action, ambushed near Salamanca, body unrecovered, official condolences from His Majesty's government. Serafina's world had shattered with such completeness that she wondered in the weeks that followed if she would ever feel whole again. The pain was not simply emotional, it was physical, visceral. Her chest ached as if her ribs had been crushed. Food turned to ash in her mouth. Sleep became an elusive phantom, and when it came, it brought dreams of Magnus calling for her, reaching for her, always just beyond her grasp. Her mother, the Countess of Eldamont, had been sympathetic but practical. "You were not even officially betrothed," she had reminded Serafina gently but firmly. "A year of mourning is generous under the circumstances. You must think of your future, darling. You are 22. Your beauty will not last forever, and neither will your father's patience." The Earl, for his part, had never approved of Magnus. Too wild, he had declared repeatedly over the years, too reckless, too unconventional, too fond of his own opinion. A man who courted danger as other men courted ladies at Almack's. The Duke of Thornridge had been a brilliant military strategist, yes, and his lineage was impeccable, but he possessed a stubborn independence that the Earl found troubling. Such a man would not be easily controlled, easily guided into advantageous political alliances. When Magnus fell, the Earl saw not tragedy but opportunity. His daughter was beautiful, accomplished, well-educated, and still unmarried. In the marriage market of the Tun, she was a prize of considerable value. He could secure a far more advantageous match, one that would elevate the Alderbury family to unprecedented heights of influence and power. Enter Lord Cedric Harrowmont. Cedric was everything Magnus was not, and the Earl approved heartily of this fact. Where Magnus had been passionate, Cedric was calculated. Where Magnus had been spontaneous and occasionally impulsive, Cedric was methodical and deliberate in all things. Where Magnus had possessed a warrior's roughness and a tendency toward plain speaking that sometimes bordered on bluntness, Cedric was polished to a mirror shine, every word carefully chosen, every gesture precisely calibrated for maximum effect. He was also ambitious, extraordinarily wealthy. His family's shipping empire had made them one of the richest families in England, and possessed connections in Parliament that could open doors the Earl had spent decades trying to breach. The match was, in the Earl's estimation, perfect. Cedric began his courtship 6 months after the news of Magnus's death, approaching it with the same strategic planning he applied to his business ventures. He called upon the Alderbury household with appropriate frequency, not so often as to seem desperate, but regularly enough to demonstrate serious intent. He brought thoughtful gifts, a first edition of Byron's latest work for Serafina, who was known to appreciate poetry, hothouse flowers in the depths of winter, a beautiful mare for her morning rides in Hyde Park. He was unfailingly courteous to her mother, deferential to her father, and attentive to Serafina herself in ways that were proper and appropriate. He never overstepped, never pressed for more than what propriety allowed. In company, he was charming and witty. In private conversation, he spoke of his plans, his ambitions, the life he envisioned for himself and his future wife. The problem, Serafina thought with bitter clarity, was that she felt nothing, not attraction, not affection, not even mild interest. When Cedric took her hand to help her from a carriage, she felt only the cool touch of his gloved fingers. When he smiled at her, she observed the technical perfection of his features, but felt no warmth in response. When he spoke of the future, she heard words but could summon no excitement, no anticipation, no joy. But she was hollowed out by grief, a shell of the woman she had been, and she had neither the strength nor the will to refuse her father's increasingly insistent suggestions that she accept Cedric's suit. What did it matter? Magnus was dead. Her heart lay buried with him in some unmarked grave in Spain. What difference did it make whom she married? The betrothal was announced in the spring of 1816, exactly 1 year after the news of Magnus's death. The wedding was set for January of 1818, a date that allowed for proper planning and gave Serafina time to prepare her trousseau and adjust to the idea of becoming Lady Harrowmont. The Tun congratulated her. Her mother was pleased. Her father was triumphant. Cedric was satisfied. And Serafina learned to wear a mask so convincing that even she sometimes forgot it was there. In public, she was the picture of a contented bride-to-be. She smiled at Cedric's attentions, accepted his gifts with apparent pleasure, and allowed him to escort her to balls and soirees, to the theatre and the opera, to dinners and garden parties. She learned to respond to his conversation with appropriate interest, to laugh at his jokes, to look at him with an expression that might pass for fondness in dim lighting. But in the darkness of her chamber, when the servants had extinguished the candles and she lay alone in her bed, she wept for the man she had lost. She pressed her face into her pillow to muffle the sounds of her grief, for it would not do for anyone to hear. She clutched to her chest a handkerchief Magnus had given her once, now faded and worn from countless nights of secret mourning. She did not love Cedric. She suspected she never would, that her capacity for such feeling had died with Magnus. But love, she had learned, was a luxury women of her station could not afford. Marriage was about alliance, about property, about the continuation of family lines and the accumulation of power. Romantic love was the stuff of novels and fairy tales, not the reality of a lady's life in Regency England. She would marry Cedric. She would be a dutiful wife. She would manage his household, bear his children, and perform all the obligations her position required. And if her heart remained locked in a tomb with a dead duke, well, that was her private burden to bear. The Winter Ball of 1817 was the social event of the season, the glittering apex of the autumn calendar. The Duchess of Ravenscroft, a formidable woman in her 60s who wielded social influence with the precision of a general deploying troops, hosted the affair at her magnificent Grosvenor Square mansion. The ballroom was a masterpiece of architecture, with soaring ceilings adorned with frescoes depicting classical mythology, walls covered in silk damask in shades of cream and gold, and windows that rose from floor to ceiling, offering views of the torchlit garden beyond. Every person of consequence would be in attendance, and Serafina's presence was not merely expected, but required. In less than a month, she would become Lady Harrowmont, and this would be one of her final appearances as Lady Serafina Alderbury. The Duchess had made it clear that she expected the affianced couple to lead the first waltz, a public display that would underscore the appropriateness and desirability of the match. Serafina dressed with care that evening, though the process felt mechanical, as if she were preparing a doll rather than herself. Her lady's maid, Martha, who had been with her since childhood, helped her into a gown of deep emerald silk. The colour was striking against her fair skin and brought out the golden undertones in her auburn hair. The bodice was cut fashionably low, trimmed with delicate Belgian lace, and the skirt fell in elegant folds that whispered softly with each movement. Martha wove Serafina's hair into an elaborate coiffure, weaving through it pearls that had belonged to Serafina's grandmother. Drop earrings of pearls and diamonds adorned her ears, and around her throat she fastened the diamond necklace Cedric had given her as a betrothal gift. It was an exquisite piece, worth a small fortune, each stone flawless and perfectly matched. It also felt like a collar, a glittering symbol of ownership that sat heavy against her collarbones. "You look beautiful, my lady," Martha said softly, meeting Serafina's eyes in the mirror. There was sympathy in the older woman's gaze. Martha had been there when the news of Magnus's death arrived. She had held Serafina as she wept, had brought her tea she couldn't drink and food she couldn't eat, had maintained discreet silence about her mistress's grief. "Thank you, Martha," Serafina replied, managing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Cedric arrived to collect her precisely at the appointed hour. Punctuality was one of his many virtues, along with reliability, fiscal responsibility, and an unwavering commitment to propriety. He handed her up into his gleaming black carriage with practiced gallantry, his touch impersonal despite the intimacy implied by their betrothal. As the carriage made its way through the lamplit streets of London, Cedric spoke of politics and business. He was planning to stand for a seat in Parliament, he informed her, and with Lord Liverpool's government facing mounting pressure over various reforms, opportunities for advancement were presenting themselves. He had also decided to purchase an estate in Surrey, a property with excellent prospects for agricultural improvement and conveniently situated near London. "It will be your primary residence once we are wed," he told her, his tone suggesting he was conferring a great honour. "The London house is well enough for the season, but a woman's place is in the country, overseeing the household, managing the staff, perhaps involving yourself in charitable works among the tenants. You'll find it quite agreeable, I'm certain." Serafina listened with half an ear, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. The streets were crowded with carriages, all heading in the same direction, drawn by the irresistible pull of the Duchess of Ravenscroft's ball. The windows of the townhouses glowed warmly in the winter darkness, each one a small world unto itself, filled with lives she would never know, stories she would never hear. "You seem distracted, my dear," Cedric observed, and there was a note of disapproval in his voice that made Serafina's shoulders tense. "I trust you are not unwell." "Merely fatigued," she replied smoothly, offering him the smile she had perfected over the past 18 months. "The season has been rather exhausting, with all the engagements and preparations for the wedding." "Then you shall be relieved when we are wed, and can retire to the country," he said, patting her hand in a gesture that was likely meant to be comforting, but felt patronizing. "A wife's place is in her husband's home, not gadding about London ballrooms season after season. Such constant social exertion is unhealthy for a woman's delicate constitution." Serafina said nothing, though his words settled like stones in her stomach. She had heard this philosophy before from her father and from Cedric himself, repeated with the confidence of men who had never questioned the structures that granted them freedom, while restricting women to ever-narrowing spheres of influence. Once married, her life would be circumscribed by Cedric's wishes, her days filled with the management of his household and eventually the rearing of his children. She would be comfortable, certainly, and secure, but she would not be free. Not that it mattered, she reminded herself. Freedom was another luxury she could not afford. The Duchess of Ravenscroft's ballroom was a spectacle of opulence that would have impressed even the most jaded observer. Hundreds of candles burned in crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off the gilded mirrors that lined the walls, creating an effect of infinite space and radiance. The air was perfumed with the scent of hothouse flowers, lilies and roses and exotic blooms imported at great expense, and warming dishes had been set up in an adjoining room, offering delicacies that represented the very pinnacle of culinary achievement. Ladies in gowns of every colour imaginable moved through the space like jewelled butterflies, their fans fluttering, their jewellery catching the light. Gentlemen in formal evening dress congregated in small groups, discussing politics and business and the latest scandals. The orchestra, positioned in a gallery overlooking the ballroom, played with professional competence, the music swelling and dipping like waves upon an invisible shore. Serafina moved through the crowd on Cedric's arm, greeting acquaintances and accepting congratulations on her upcoming nuptials. She had perfected the art of appearing engaged while feeling absolutely nothing, of smiling and nodding and making appropriate responses while her mind drifted elsewhere. She was thinking of Magnus, as she so often did, wondering what he would have thought of this spectacle, this display of wealth and privilege. Magnus had never been entirely comfortable in these glittering social spaces. He had been too honest, too direct, too impatient with the endless games of precedence and social maneuvering that defined the ton. He had attended because his position required it, but he had made no secret of his preference for more straightforward company. She could almost hear his voice in her mind, dry and amused. If peacocks were human, they would all be members of the ton. The memory brought a genuine smile to her lips, small and sad and fleeting. Cedric, noticing, misinterpreted it as pleasure in the evening's entertainment and looked satisfied. Then the music stopped. The cessation was so sudden, so complete, that it took a moment for the assembly to notice. The orchestra simply stopped playing mid-phrase, leaving the final note hanging in the air like a question without an answer. Conversations faltered, then fell silent as confusion rippled through the ballroom. Heads turned, seeking the source of the disruption. And Serafina felt it before she saw anything, before she heard anything. A prickling along her spine, an electric charge in the air that raised the fine hairs on the back of her neck and made her breath catch in her throat. It was the sensation of the world tilting on its axis, of reality shifting in some fundamental way. The massive doors at the far end of the ballroom, doors that stood perhaps 15 feet high, carved from mahogany, and adorned with the Ravencroft coat of arms, opened with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. A man stood in the entrance, backlit by the light from the corridor beyond, and for a moment he was little more than a silhouette, a dark shape that seemed to draw the light into itself rather than reflecting it. Then he stepped forward, into the illumination of the ballroom, and Serafina's world ended and began again in the same instant. Magnus. The champagne flute slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound like breaking crystal, like breaking hearts. The golden liquid spread across the white marble in a puddle that caught the candlelight, but Serafina didn't see it. She saw nothing but him. Magnus Hale de Thornridge, Duke of Thornridge, who was supposed to be dead, who had been mourned and memorialized and consigned to memory, stood in the entrance to the Duchess of Ravencroft's ballroom, alive and undeniably real. He had changed. 3 years of war had marked him in ways both visible and invisible. He was leaner than she remembered, the boyish softness gone from his face, leaving only hard angles and sharp planes. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, brushing his collar in a way that would have scandalized his valet. His face bore scars that told stories of violence and survival, a thin silver line bisecting his left eyebrow, another along his jaw, and others she could glimpse at his collar and wrists. But it was his eyes that arrested her, stole her breath, made her heart stutter and then race. Those grey eyes, storm-colored and burning with an intensity that seemed to sear the air itself, swept the crowd with predatory focus until they found her. And then the world stopped. Across the expanse of the ballroom, through hundreds of bodies and 3 years of grief and loss and resignation, their eyes met. The impact was physical, visceral, as if he had reached across that distance and touched her. Serafina felt it in her chest, in her bones, in the very marrow of her being. Every nerve ending came alive, every sense heightened. She was aware of her heartbeat, thundering so hard she thought her ribs might crack, of her breath, shallow and rapid, of the weight of the diamond necklace at her throat, suddenly oppressive. She was aware with terrible clarity that she had been sleepwalking through the past 3 years, and Magnus's gaze had just shocked her back to wakefulness. In Magnus's mind, the ballroom was a battlefield, and he was assessing it with the strategic eye of a man who had survived 3 years of war. He catalogued exits, identified potential threats, noted the positions of allies and enemies. But all of that was background noise, tactical information filed away for later consideration, because all that truly mattered was her, Serafina. His Serafina, standing in the center of the ballroom in a gown the color of emeralds, more beautiful than memory had preserved her, and more distant than the Spanish mountains he had crossed to reach her. She was here, alive, real, and looking at him with an expression that cycled through shock, disbelief, and something that looked like joy before settling into confusion and fear. And she was standing beside another man. A man whose hand was on her elbow, in a gesture of possession that made Magnus's vision tinge red at the edges. He began to walk toward her, and the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses. No one attempted to stop him, though he saw recognition dawning on face after face. Whispers exploded in his wake. Thornridge. Alive. Impossible. How? But Magnus paid them no attention. His focus was singular, absolute. Every step brought him closer to Serafina, and with each step he saw more. The diamonds at her throat, not his diamonds, he noted with savage displeasure. The way she held herself, poised but brittle, like a porcelain figure that might shatter at a touch. The pallor beneath her rouge, the shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She had suffered, he realized. Whatever had happened in his absence, whatever lies had been told to separate them, she had suffered for it. And someone would pay dearly for causing her pain. Serafina. Her name emerged from his lips, roughened by time and war, by screaming orders across battlefields and staying silent through interrogations, by 3 years of holding her name in his heart like a talisman. It was a caress and a claim, a prayer and a promise. Beside her, the man, and Magnus knew without being told that this was Lord Cedric Harrowmont, the usurper who had dared to lay claim to what was his, stiffened. His hand tightened on Serafina's elbow, fingers digging into her flesh hard enough that Magnus saw her wince. "Thornridge," Harrowmont said, and his tone attempted coolness, but couldn't quite mask the tremor of unease. "We were told you were dead." Magnus finally tore his gaze from Serafina to acknowledge the other man's existence. The look he gave Harrowmont was the same look he had given enemy soldiers in the instant before engaging them in combat, cold, assessing, utterly devoid of mercy. "Clearly," he said softly, "that report was premature." In those few seconds of silence that followed, Serafina's mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over each other in a chaotic cascade. Magnus was alive. Alive. The word repeated in her mind like a drumbeat, like a prayer, like a scream. He was alive, and he was here, and everything she had believed for 3 years was a lie. The grief she had carried, the mourning that had hollowed her out, the resignation with which she had accepted Cedric's suit, all of it had been predicated on Magnus's death. But he wasn't dead. He was here, looking at her with those grey eyes that had haunted her dreams, and the expression in them was destroying her. She saw fury there, yes, but also pain. Accusation mixed with longing, possessiveness warring with uncertainty. And beneath it all, love, fierce and undiminished and absolutely terrifying in its intensity. "This is most irregular," Cedric said, attempting to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Lady Serafina is my betrothed. We are to be wed in less than a month, whatever business you believe you have with her. Remove your hand from her." Magnus's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it carried through the silent ballroom with the force of a shout. The menace in those 5 words made several nearby gentlemen take an involuntary step back. Cedric's face flushed with outrage. "I beg your pardon." "I said," Magnus repeated, and now his voice dropped even lower, became even more dangerous. "Remove your hand from my lady, or I will remove it for you. And I assure you, Harrowmont, you will not appreciate my methods." The possessive pronoun hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. Gasps rippled through the assembled crowd. Ladies pressed gloved hands to their mouths. Gentlemen exchanged glances that ranged from scandalized to gleeful. This was a spectacle beyond anything the season had yet produced. "Your lady?" Cedric's laugh was brittle, edged with hysteria. "I think 3 years of absence has addled your wits, Thornridge. Lady Serafina is to be my wife in less than a month. The contracts are signed, the settlements agreed upon. Whatever understanding you may have once shared is ancient history, a youthful indiscretion long since—" "Ancient history?" Magnus interrupted, and the rage in his voice made the chandeliers seem to tremble. "You dare speak of our love as ancient history? You dare stand there, your hand on her arm like a claim of ownership, and dismiss 3 years of her grief, of my suffering, as youthful indiscretion?" He took another step forward, closing the distance until he was near enough to touch, and Cedric had to tilt his head back slightly to maintain eye contact. Magnus was taller, broader, and the violence that radiated from him was palpable. This was not a gentleman who settled disputes with cutting remarks and social snubs. This was a man who had killed, who had survived by being harder and more ruthless than his enemies, and every person in that ballroom recognized it on some primal level. "Serafina," Magnus said, never taking his eyes from Cedric's face, "look at me, please." She had no choice. Her gaze was drawn to his as if by magnetic force, and when their eyes met again, she felt tears burning behind her own. This was Magnus, her Magnus, who had held her gently despite his warrior's hands, who had read poetry to her in sunlit gardens, who had promised her forever and then vanished into death. Except he hadn't died. He had been somewhere, surviving something, while she mourned and her father arranged her marriage to another man. "Did you wait for me?" Magnus asked, and the question was a plea and an indictment all at once. The tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks and undoubtedly ruining her carefully applied cosmetics. Her throat closed around the words she needed to say, and for a moment she could only stare at him, drinking in the reality of him, the impossible fact of his presence. "They told me you were dead," she finally managed, her voice breaking on the words. "The War Office sent confirmation. Your solicitor read your will. There was a memorial service at Westminster Abbey. The Archbishop himself delivered the sermon. You were dead, Magnus. How are you here?" Something flickered in Magnus's expression, surprise followed by a dawning understanding that was terrible to witness, and then a rage so profound that Serafina felt its heat from where she stood. When he spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. "Who told you?" he demanded. "Who delivered the news of my death?" I don't recall precisely." Serafina's mind was still reeling, struggling to process the impossible. "My father received the letter. He was the one who informed me." "Your father?" Magnus's lip curled, and he turned his attention to scan the crowd until he found the Earl of Eldamont standing near the refreshment table, his complexion gone ashen. "Eldamont, how very convenient that you were the recipient of my death notice, that you were the one to inform your daughter of my demise. Tell me, did you pen the forgery yourself or did you pay someone to do it for you?" The accusation landed like a bomb in the center of the ballroom. The Earl's face went from pale to crimson, and he sputtered with outrage. "How dare you? You accuse me of forgery, of conspiracy? This is slander of the worst sort. I'll have you brought before the magistrate." "By all means do so," Magnus invited, his tone glacial. "I would be absolutely delighted to present my evidence before a court of law." "I'm certain everyone present would be fascinated to learn how a letter bearing the War Office seal came to be delivered to you, personally, informing you of my death, when no such letter was ever sent by the War Office, when I was, in fact, not dead at all, but merely held captive in a Spanish prison." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Ladies shrieked, gentlemen shouted, the Duchess of Ravencroft called for order, her voice lost in the cacophony. But Magnus paid no attention to any of it. His focus remained fixed on the Earl, who had gone pale again, a sheen of perspiration visible on his forehead despite the winter chill. "You did this," Magnus continued, advancing on the Earl like a wolf stalking wounded prey. "While I was fighting for my life, you saw an opportunity. You forged documents declaring me dead. You presented them to your daughter, knowing she would be devastated, knowing that in her grief she would be vulnerable. And then you pushed her toward Harrowmont, using her sorrow and her sense of duty to manipulate her into a match that served your political ambitions. You cannot prove any of this," the Earl blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "These are the wild accusations of a man clearly unhinged by his experiences in the war. You have no evidence." "I have the original War Office records," Magnus interrupted coldly. "I have testimony from the Secretary of War himself, confirming that no notice of my death was ever issued. I have correspondence from my solicitor, proving that no will was read, no estate settled. And I have this." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, which he held up for all to see. "This is a letter written by your own hand, to a clerk in the War Office, a clerk who has since been dismissed for accepting bribes. In it you request that certain documents be created, documents that would serve your purposes, in arranging a marriage for your daughter. You were careless, Eldamont. You left a trail." The Earl's face collapsed. For a moment, he looked like a man watching his entire world crumble around him. Then he rallied, attempting one last defense. "I did what was necessary. You were gone, missing for months with no word. The war was going badly. Every day brought news of more casualties. It was only reasonable to assume you had fallen. Serafina was wasting away with grief. I acted in her best interest." "You acted in your own interest." Serafina's voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear, and vibrating with a fury she had never before given voice to. Every eye in the ballroom turned to her, and she felt the weight of their attention, but she didn't care. All her carefully maintained composure, all the masks she had worn for 18 months, shattered in an instant. She advanced on her father, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her body trembling with rage. "You lied to me. You let me believe the man I loved was dead. You let me mourn him for a year. You watched me grieve, watched me hollow out with sorrow, and you said nothing. You did nothing. Because it suited your purposes, because you could use my pain to push me toward the match you wanted." "Serafina, you must understand," the Earl began, but she cut him off. "I understand perfectly." Her voice was cold now, cold as the winter air outside, cold as the diamonds at her throat. "I understand that you value power and position more than you value my happiness, that you saw my love as an inconvenience to be managed, an obstacle to be removed, that you betrayed me in the most fundamental way a father can betray a daughter." She turned away from him, unable to bear the sight of his face, and found herself looking at Magnus once more. He stood a few feet away, his expression raw with a mixture of triumph and anguish. 3 years, she whispered. "Magnus, where have you been?" And so he told her, told all of them, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath it, the words painting a picture of suffering and survival that left the ballroom in stunned silence. After Salamanca, his regiment had been ambushed by French forces while attempting to secure a strategic position in the mountains. The attack had come at dawn, swift and merciless. Most of his men had died in the initial assault. Good men, brave men, who had followed him into hell because they trusted him to bring them home. The guilt of surviving when they had not still weighed upon him like a physical burden. Magnus had been captured along with a handful of others and taken to a fortress prison deep in the Pyrenees, a place so remote that rescue was impossible, escape seemed futile. The conditions had been brutal beyond description. Starvation rations, beatings, interrogations that went beyond questioning into the realm of systematic torture designed to break not just the body, but the spirit. They wanted information, Magnus said, his voice flat, recounting horrors as if they were military statistics. Troop movements, supply lines, strategic plans. I gave them nothing. We gave them nothing. He paused, and Serafina saw his jaw clench, saw the way his hands flexed as if remembering pain. The torture was extensive, creative. The French officers in charge of the prison had refined cruelty into an art form, but I survived it. Do you know how? The question was directed at Serafina, and she shook her head, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. I thought of you. His voice softened, became almost tender despite the horror of what he described. Every time they broke me down, every time I thought I couldn't endure another moment, I rebuilt myself around the memory of your face, your laugh, the way you looked in sunlight, the feel of your hand in mine. You were my anchor, Serafina. You kept me sane when sanity was the hardest thing to hold on to. Tears streamed down Serafina's face now, unchecked and unashamed. Around them, she was dimly aware that many of the ladies in attendance were weeping as well, moved by the raw emotion in Magnus's account. After 18 months in that hell, an opportunity presented itself. A transfer of prisoners to another facility, less well-guarded. I escaped with 2 others, men who had become brothers through shared suffering. We fought our way across hostile territory, living like animals, stealing what we needed to survive, always moving, always hunted. His gaze grew distant, seeing landscapes that existed only in memory. We crossed the mountains in winter with inadequate clothing and no supplies. We evaded French patrols and Spanish bandits. We nearly starved in the wilderness between towns. One of my companions died of fever. The other was killed by bandits 3 days from the Portuguese border. I reached British lines alone, half dead from wounds and exposure, speaking barely coherently. He focused on Serafina again, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. The British forces I found were camped near Lisbon. They didn't believe me at first, thought I was a French spy or a deserter spinning tales. It took weeks to confirm my identity, to convince them I was who I claimed to be. And during that time, while I was recovering from my wounds, regaining my strength, I learned about your betrothal. His voice hardened on that last word. 4 months ago, I was lying in a hospital bed, still weak from my ordeal, when an officer brought me a newspaper, and there in the society pages I read about the impending marriage of Lady Serafina Alderbury to Lord Cedric Harrowmont. A winter wedding, How lovely. The bitterness in his tone could have stripped paint from walls. I knew then that something was wrong. You had promised to wait for me. You had promised, so either you had broken that promise willingly, which I refused to believe, or someone had interfered. Someone had made it impossible for you to wait. He turned his attention back to the Earl, and his expression was merciless. I began to investigate. Even weakened, even still recovering, I used every contact I had, pulled every string, called in every favor owed to me, and the truth emerged piece by piece, the forged documents, the bribed clerks, the elaborate deception designed to convince my beloved that I was dead so that her father could sell her to the highest bidder. Now see here, Cedric began, finally finding his voice, but Magnus rounded on him with such ferocity that the other man actually stumbled backward. You, Magnus said, the single word dripping with contempt. You knew. Don't pretend you didn't. You knew the circumstances were suspicious. You knew Serafina was grieving. You knew she didn't love you, but you didn't care, did you? All you cared about was acquiring a beautiful, well-connected wife who would enhance your social standing and provide you with heirs. Her feelings were irrelevant. Her happiness meant nothing. I treated her with perfect propriety, Cedric protested, his face flushed. I courted her appropriately, gave her gifts, showed her every courtesy. You treated her like a prize to be won, Magnus interrupted savagely, like a possession to be acquired. You never once asked yourself why a vibrant, passionate woman seemed so hollow, so lifeless in your presence. You never wondered why she looked at you without warmth, why she smiled without joy. Because you didn't care. She was suitable, and that was sufficient. He took a step toward Cedric, then another, and his voice dropped to a deadly whisper. Well, I'm back now, and I'm here to tell you that Lady Serafina is not suitable. She is not available. She is not yours. She is mine. She has always been mine, and I will see you in hell before I let you put a ring on her finger. This is outrageous, Cedric sputtered, looking around for support. The contracts are signed, the settlements are agreed. You cannot simply walk in here after 3 years and expect, I can, and I do. Magnus's tone brooked no argument. Those contracts were signed under false pretenses, based on the fraudulent claim that I was dead. They are void. Legally, morally, in every way that matters, they are void. He turned back to Serafina, and his expression softened, became vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache. Serafina. I need you to tell me something, and I need you to be honest, even if the truth will destroy me. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. What? Do you love him? The question emerged rough, painful, as if speaking it cost him dearly. In the time I was gone, did your feelings change? Did you come to care for Harrowmont? Because if you did, if you chose him freely, if you love him, I will walk away. It will kill me, but I will respect your choice. But if you were coerced, if you were manipulated, if you accepted him only because you believed I was dead and you saw no other option, then I'm asking you to choose again. Here, now, in front of everyone, choose me. The ballroom held its collective breath. This was the moment every romantic heart in the assembly had been waiting for, the culmination of a drama that would be retold in drawing rooms and parlors for years to come. Serafina looked at Cedric, at the man who had courted her with calculated precision, who had never once made her pulse race or her heart sing, who had offered her security and status but never passion, never understanding, never love. Then she looked at Magnus, at his scarred face and haunted eyes, at the man who had survived hell for the memory of her, who stood before her, now offering not comfort but chaos, not ease but intensity, not a peaceful life but a passionate one. The choice was absurdly simple. I don't love him, she said clearly, her voice carrying through the silent ballroom. I never loved him. I agreed to marry him because I thought you were dead, because my father insisted, because I was too broken by grief to fight. But my heart never stopped being yours, Magnus. Not for a single day, not for a single moment. The words hung in the air like a benediction, and she saw Magnus's expression transform. The vulnerability gave way to fierce joy, to triumph, to a love so powerful it seemed to radiate from him like light. Then come with me, he said, extending his hand toward her. "Come with me now, Serafina. Leave this place. Leave these people who tried to keep us apart. Be with me." She should refuse. She was a lady of good breeding, raised to follow rules, to respect propriety, to honor contracts even when they chafed. What Magnus was asking her to do would cause the scandal of the century. Her reputation would be in tatters, Cedric would be humiliated, her father would be ruined, society would never forgive her. But Magnus was alive, Magnus had come back for her, Magnus loved her, and suddenly propriety seemed a very small price to pay. She placed her hand in his, and the moment their skin touched, she felt it. An electric current that ran from his fingers to hers, racing up her arm, flooding through her entire body, until she felt more alive than she had in 3 years. His hand closed around hers, warm and strong and possessive, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. "Yes," she said simply, "take me away from here." Magnus's smile was brilliant, transforming his war-hardened features into something beautiful and heartbreakingly young. "Thank God," he breathed, and then he was pulling her toward the exit, through the stunned crowd, toward the doors that stood open on the winter night. Behind them, chaos erupted. Cedric shouted protests. The Earl called for someone to stop them. The Duchess of Ravencroft demanded order, but no one moved to intervene. Perhaps they were too shocked. Perhaps they recognized the futility of standing between two people whose love had survived war and deception and 3 years of separation. Or perhaps, beneath all their proper behavior and rigid adherence to social rules, they were romantics at heart, and this was the kind of love story that made even the most cynical heart believe in fairy tales. Magnus led Serafina through the glass doors onto the terrace, and the cold night air hit her like a slap, shocking and bracing. Behind them, they could hear the muffled sounds of the chaos they'd left in their wake. Voices raised in anger and excitement, the Duchess attempting to restore order, the whole glittering assembly of London society reeling from what they'd just witnessed. But out here in the lamplit darkness it was just the two of them. Magnus pulled her into the shadows of the colonnade, away from prying eyes, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Serafina's mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over each other too quickly to process. Magnus was alive. Magnus was here. Magnus was holding her hand, and she could feel his pulse against her palm, steady and strong and real. "You're really here," she whispered, the words inadequate to express the enormity of what she felt. "I'm not dreaming. You're really alive." "I'm here," he confirmed, his free hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "God, Serafina, you have no idea how many times I dreamed of this, of touching you again, of hearing your voice, of seeing your face. It was all that kept me going." She covered his hand with her own, pressing it more firmly against her cheek. His palm was rough with calluses, marked by the same hardships that had carved lines around his eyes and left scars on his skin. But his touch was gentle, reverent, as if she were something precious and fragile. "I thought you were dead," she said again, needing him to understand. "I mourned you, Magnus. I grieved. I wanted to die myself because living without you seemed unbearable." His jaw clenched, and she saw pain flash across his features. "Your father will answer for what he did, I swear it. He stole 3 years from us, 3 years we can never get back. He made you suffer, and he will pay for that." "Later," Serafina said urgently. "We can deal with my father later. Right now, I need to know this is real, that you're real. Kiss me, Magnus, please." She didn't have to ask twice. His mouth descended on hers with a hunger that bordered on desperation, and Serafina met him with equal fervor. This was nothing like the chaste, proper kisses she had shared with Magnus in their courtship years ago, stolen moments in gardens when they were careful to maintain propriety, even in their passion. This was raw and unrestrained. 3 years of longing and grief and love poured into a single kiss. Magnus's arms came around her, pulling her against him with a force that drove the breath from her lungs, and Serafina clung to him, her fingers twisting in the fabric of his coat. She could feel the solid reality of him, the warmth of his body, the rapid beat of his heart against her chest, the barely restrained power in his embrace. He was real. He was alive. He was here. When they finally broke apart, Both breathing hard, Magnus rested his forehead against hers. In the dim light, she could see that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Marry me," he said hoarsely. "Not in 3 weeks to a man you don't love. Marry me. Tonight." Serafina pulled back slightly to stare at him. "Tonight? Magnus, that's impossible. There are laws, procedures, bans to be read." "I have a special license." He reached into his coat with his free hand. The other still held hers in a grip that suggested he had no intention of ever letting go, and withdrew a folded document. "From the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. It took considerable persuasion, most of my remaining political capital, and a favor I'll probably regret calling in, but I have it. We can be married tonight, immediately, and by morning you'll be the Duchess of Thornridge. Harrowmont's claim will be void. Your father's schemes will be for naught." It was madness. Reckless, impulsive madness that violated every rule of propriety and social conduct she had ever been taught. A lady did not elope. A lady did not break a formal betrothal mere weeks before the wedding. A lady did not humiliate her family and intended husband in front of all society, and then compound the scandal by marrying another man the same night. But Serafina had spent 3 years being a proper lady, 3 years grieving, 3 years slowly dying inside while maintaining a perfect facade, 3 years pretending that her heart hadn't been buried with Magnus in some foreign grave. And now Magnus was here, alive and real, and offering her everything she had thought lost forever, offering her love and passion, and a future she had abandoned hope of ever having. "Yes," she said, and the word was simultaneously a prayer, a vow, and a declaration of independence. "Yes, I'll marry you. Tonight. Now. Immediately. I don't care about the scandal. I don't care what society thinks. I've lost 3 years with you. I won't lose another moment." Magnus's expression blazed with joy and relief and fierce, possessive satisfaction. "Thank God," he breathed, and then he was kissing her again, this time with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When he pulled back, his thumb traced her lower lip with reverent care. "My carriage is waiting on the street. I'll take you to my solicitor's home. He's expecting us. We'll be married within the hour, and then you'll never have to worry about your father or Harrowmont or anyone else trying to separate us again. You'll be my Duchess, under the protection of my name and my title, and they cannot touch you." "What about my father?" Serafina asked, though her voice lacked conviction. "Cedric, the consequences will be spectacular," Magnus finished with dark satisfaction. "Let them talk. Let them rage. Let them gossip and speculate and spread rumors. None of it matters. You will be my wife, legally bound to me, and there is nothing they can do to change that." He was right, Serafina realized. Once they were married, the scandal would be enormous, but it would also be irreversible. Her father could bluster and threaten, but he couldn't undo a marriage performed by a vicar with a special license from the Archbishop. Cedric could rage about breach of contract, but with Magnus's evidence of the forged death notice, any legal action would expose the Earl's fraud and only compound the Harrowmont humiliation. "There will be consequences," she felt obliged to point out, even as her heart sang with the possibility of escape, of freedom, of choosing her own destiny, for perhaps the first time in her life. "There always are," Magnus agreed, his hand squeezing hers. "But I've faced worse than social disapproval. I've faced death and torture, and the very real possibility that I would never see you again. I survived all of that through sheer will and the memory of your love. I'm not afraid of scandal. I'm not afraid of your father's anger or Harrowmont's wounded pride or society's judgment. The only thing I fear, the only thing that truly terrifies me, is the possibility of losing you again." His words, raw with emotion and absolute in their conviction, dissolved the last of Serafina's hesitation. "You won't," she promised, her own voice thick with feeling. "You won't lose me, not ever again. I'm yours, Magnus. I have always been yours." They left through the garden gate, a small wooden door half hidden by bare rose bushes that led to a narrow alley running behind the row of great houses. Magnus seemed to know exactly where he was going, moving with the confidence of a man who had planned this escape down to the smallest detail. His carriage, a sleek black affair with his ducal crest emblazoned on the door in silver, waited at the end of the alley, the horses stamping impatiently in the cold. A liveried footman saw them approaching and immediately opened the carriage door, betraying no surprise at his master's appearance with a lady who was clearly fleeing a social event in nothing but her ball gown and evening slippers. Magnus handed Serafina up, his touch lingering on her waist, then swung in after her and rapped on the roof to signal the driver. As the carriage lurched into motion, carrying them away from the chaos they'd left behind and toward an uncertain but thrilling future, Serafina allowed herself to truly look at Magnus in the close confines of the carriage interior. The lamps mounted on the walls cast flickering light across his features, illuminating the changes 3 years had wrought. He was harder now, she observed. The softness of youth had been burned away, leaving only lean muscle and sharp angles. The scars she had noticed earlier were more visible now, the one bisecting his eyebrow, another along his jaw, a third disappearing beneath his collar. His hands resting on his knees bore marks as well, old burns, healed cuts, the telltale signs of violence endured and survived. But his eyes, when they met hers, were the same. Storm grey and intense, capable of freezing or warming depending on his mood, and currently looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. Love, yes, but also desire, possession, and a vulnerability that seemed at odds with his warrior's bearing. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly, and she realized she had been staring. "I'm thinking that I don't know you anymore," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "The Magnus I knew 3 years ago was passionate but gentle. He read poetry and made terrible jokes and blushed when I caught him staring at me. This Magnus, you're different, harder, more dangerous." He was silent for a moment, his jaw working as he considered his response. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "War changes people, Serafina. What I experienced, what I survived, it left marks. Not just the physical ones you can see, but others. I have nightmares. Sometimes I wake up not knowing where I am, reaching for weapons that aren't there. Loud noises startle me. I'm quicker to anger than I used to be, slower to trust." He paused, and she saw him swallow hard. "I want to be honest with you. I'm not the same man who left for Spain. I'm darker now, harder, more damaged. If you marry me tonight, you need to understand that. You need to know that the life I'm offering you won't be the fairy tale we dreamed of in gardens 3 years ago. It will be more complicated, more difficult. I am more complicated, more difficult." Serafina reached across the space between them and took his scarred hand in both of hers. "I'm not the same person either," she said quietly. "The girl you left behind was naive, sheltered, convinced that love would conquer all obstacles. The woman I am now has learned that love is necessary but not sufficient, that life is cruel and unfair and sometimes takes the things we treasure most. I've grieved, Magnus. I've suffered. I've learned to survive in a world that was colorless and cold without you." She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses against her softer skin. "We've both changed, but the essential truth remains the same. I love you. Not the memory of who you were, not the idealized version I've carried in my heart for 3 years. I love you, the man sitting across from me now, scars and nightmares and anger and all. If you'll have me, damaged as I am, then I will gladly have you damaged as you are." Magnus's eyes closed, and she saw a muscle jump in his jaw. When he opened them again, there was such naked emotion in his gaze that it stole her breath. "Come here," he said roughly, and she went, crossing the carriage to sit beside him, to be pulled into his arms and held as if she were the most precious thing in creation. They stayed like that for the remainder of the journey. Serafina tucked against Magnus's side, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest, where she could hear the steady thump of his heartbeat. Outside, London passed by. Lamplit streets and darkened shop fronts, the occasional late-night reveller stumbling home from some entertainment. But inside the carriage, it was just the two of them, existing in a bubble of peace that felt miraculous after so much chaos. "Tell me where you've been," Serafina said quietly. "Not the dramatic version you told the ballroom, the real story. What happened to you, Magnus?" So he told her. In the darkness of the carriage, with her body pressed against his and her hand over his heart, Magnus recounted 3 years of horror in a voice that was sometimes steady and sometimes broke. He told her about the ambush, about watching his men cut down around him, about the guilt that haunted him still. He told her about the prison, about interrogations that went on for hours, about pain that made him scream until his voice gave out. He told her about the other prisoners, the bonds forged in shared suffering, about a young lieutenant named Harrison who sang hymns to keep their spirits up, about a grizzled sergeant named Fletcher who taught him how to survive on hope and stubbornness when food and water were scarce, about how they had planned their escape for months, gathering information, stealing supplies, waiting for the right moment. He told her about the escape itself, the violence of it, the blood, the desperate flight through mountain passes in winter, about watching Harrison die of fever, unable to do anything but hold his hand and promise to tell his mother he had been brave, about Fletcher being shot by bandits, dying instantly, leaving Magnus alone for the final push to safety. "I walked into that British camp more dead than alive," he said, his voice hoarse with memory. "I couldn't remember the password. Couldn't prove who I was. My papers had been lost or destroyed. They thought I was a spy or a deserter. Locked me up until they could verify my identity, which took weeks because the records were in chaos." His arm tightened around her. "And then I learned about your betrothal. Someone brought me a newspaper, thinking I'd want to catch up on news from home. I saw the announcement and Serafina, I thought I was going to die, truly die right there in that hospital bed. Because I had survived everything, the ambush, the torture, the escape, the journey, believing that you were waiting for me. And to discover that you had moved on, had agreed to marry someone else." "I'm so sorry," Serafina whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. If I had known, if I had suspected for even a moment that you might be alive—" "I know," he assured her, his lips against her hair. "I know you didn't betray me. That's why I started investigating. Because the Serafina I knew, the woman who had promised to wait for me, wouldn't have forgotten me so easily. Something had to be wrong, and once I started pulling on that thread, the entire tapestry of your father's deception unraveled." He pulled back slightly to look down at her, his hand coming up to cup her face. "I meant what I said in there. Your father will answer for what he did. Not tonight. Tonight is for us. But he will face consequences. I won't let this stand." Serafina nodded, fresh anger flaring at the thought of her father's betrayal, but she pushed it aside for now. Magnus was right. Tonight was for them. Tomorrow would be soon enough to deal with the aftermath of their choices. The carriage slowed, then stopped. Magnus glanced out the window, then looked back at her with a smile that was boyish and excited despite everything they had just discussed. "We're here." Mr. Whitmore's home was a respectable townhouse in Bloomsbury, well-maintained but not ostentatious. The elderly solicitor himself answered the door, dressed in a banyan and nightcap, suggesting he had been prepared to retire for the evening, but had stayed up, awaiting their arrival. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to Magnus, then turned to Serafina with a warmer smile. "And Lady Serafina, welcome. Everything is prepared as you requested, Your Grace. The vicar is waiting in the drawing room, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Simmons, is present to serve as witness." "Thank you, Whitmore," Magnus said, his hand finding Serafina's once more. "I appreciate your discretion in this matter. Think nothing of it, Your Grace. I'm honored to be of service." He stepped aside to let them enter, then led them through the narrow hallway to a cozy drawing room where a fire burned cheerfully in the grate. The vicar was a round-faced man in his 60s, his expression kind but slightly bewildered by the late-night summons and the obvious haste of the proceedings. Mrs. Simmons, the housekeeper, was a stout woman with grey hair and shrewd eyes that assessed Serafina with frank curiosity. There was no wedding breakfast, no elaborate ceremony, no processional or flowers or any of the traditional trappings that usually accompanied the marriage of a duke. Instead, there was just the vicar's steady voice reading the ancient words of the marriage service, Magnus and Serafina standing before the fire holding hands, and two witnesses observing with varying degrees of interest. But when it came time for Magnus to repeat his vows, his voice was strong and clear and absolutely certain. "I, Magnus Hale de Thornridge, take thee, Serafina Margaret Alderbury, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." And when Serafina spoke her own vows, she meant every word with a fervour that surprised her. This wasn't the grand society wedding she had once dreamed of, but it was real and true and chosen, and that made it infinitely more precious. When Magnus slid a gold band onto her finger, his grandmother's ring, he told her in a whisper, which he had carried through the war like a talisman, Serafina felt something fundamental shift inside her. The last piece of her broken heart slotted back into place, and for the first time in 3 years she felt truly whole. "I pronounce you man and wife," the vicar intoned, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "You may kiss your bride, Your Grace." Magnus did, cupping her face in both hands and kissing her with a tenderness that made tears spring to her eyes once more. When he pulled back, his own eyes were bright with unshed tears, and his smile was luminous. "Duchess," he murmured, and the single word was imbued with such love and possession and relief that it made her heart clench. "My Duchess." "My Duke," she replied, and laughed through her tears, the sound bright and free and utterly joyful. "My impossible, stubborn, miraculous Duke." They signed the register, Serafina's new signature looking strange and wonderful on the page, and accepted congratulations from Mr. Whitmore and Mrs. Simmons, who both seemed genuinely moved by the obvious emotion between bride and groom. Then Magnus was leading her back to the carriage, back into the winter night, toward his townhouse and their future together. The house in Berkeley Square was imposing, a grand Palladian structure that spoke of old money and older bloodlines. The staff, roused despite the late hour, lined up in the entrance hall to greet them, their expressions ranging from shocked to delighted. The butler, an elderly man with dignified bearing, bowed deeply. Your Grace," he said, addressing first Magnus, then Serafina, and she felt a thrill at hearing herself addressed by her new title. "May I offer my congratulations on behalf of the entire staff? We are honored to serve you." "Thank you, Henderson," Magnus said warmly. "Please inform the staff that the Duchess and I will be residing here for the immediate future. We'll discuss household arrangements in the morning." "Of course, Your Grace. Mrs. Patterson has prepared the ducal suite." Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, stepped forward with a warm smile. "If you'll follow me, Your Graces, I'll show you to your rooms." She led them up a sweeping staircase to the second floor, down a corridor lined with portraits of previous dukes and duchesses of Thornridge, to a set of double doors at the end. "The ducal suite, Your Graces. I've had fires lit and warming pans placed in the beds. If you need anything at all, you need only ring." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson," Serafina managed, suddenly acutely aware that she was about to be alone with Magnus for the first time as his wife. The housekeeper bobbed a curtsy and withdrew, closing the doors behind her with a soft click that seemed very loud in the sudden silence. Serafina looked around the suite with wide eyes. It was magnificent. A sitting room decorated in shades of blue and gold, with elegant furniture and paintings that were probably worth small fortunes. Through an open doorway, she could glimpse the bedroom beyond, dominated by a massive four-poster bed hung with midnight blue velvet curtains. "Do you like it?" Magnus asked, and she turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "It's beautiful," she said honestly, "though I confess it's rather overwhelming. This morning I was Lady Serafina Alderbury, living in my father's house. Tonight I'm the Duchess of Thornridge, standing in what is apparently my home now, and my mind hasn't quite caught up with the reality of it." Magnus crossed the room to her, moving with that predatory grace that was new, that spoke of a man who had learned to survive by being faster and more dangerous than his enemies. But when he took her hands, his touch was gentle. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked quietly, and she heard the vulnerability beneath the question. "It's not too late to have the marriage annulled. If you've realized that you made a mistake—" "No," Serafina interrupted firmly, squeezing his hands. "No second thoughts, no regrets, I'm just adjusting. Everything has happened so fast. This morning Magnus was dead. Tonight he's my husband. It's a lot to process." "We have time," Magnus assured her. "All the time in the world. We don't have to do anything tonight except be together. We can talk or sit in comfortable silence or simply sleep. Whatever you need." Serafina looked up at him, at this man who had survived hell for her, who had fought his way back across hostile territory for the chance to see her again, who had walked into a ballroom and claimed her in front of all society, and felt a rush of love so powerful it made her dizzy. "I need you," she said simply. "I need to know that this is real, that you're real, that I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and discover this was all a beautiful dream." Magnus's eyes darkened with emotion. "I'm real," he promised, pulling her closer. "This is real, we're real, and you're not going to wake up alone ever again." He kissed her then, and it was different from the desperate kisses they had shared on the terrace. This was slower, deeper, more deliberate. This was a husband kissing his wife, a man claiming his beloved, a promise made physical. Serafina melted into it, her arms coming up to circle his neck, her body pressing against his. She could feel the heat of him through the layers of fabric that separated them, the solid strength of his body, the thundering of his heartbeat that matched her own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Magnus rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you since you were 18 years old and laughed at one of my terrible jokes at the Havershams' garden party. I have loved you through 3 years of separation and suffering. I have loved you when loving you was all I had to keep me sane, and I will love you until my last breath, Serafina. That is my vow to you, more sacred than the ones we spoke before the vicar." Serafina felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming love. "I love you too," she whispered. "I never stopped. Even when I thought you were dead, even when I had agreed to marry Cedric, my heart was yours. It has always been yours. It will always be yours." And then there were no more words, only touch and sensation, and the exquisite rightness of being in his arms, of being his wife, of finally, after 3 years of grief and loneliness, coming home. Magnus's hands moved to the fastenings of her gown, with a combination of urgency and reverence, his fingers fumbling slightly with the delicate hooks and buttons. Serafina helped him, her own hands shaking, as she worked to remove his coat, his waistcoat, the layers of civilized clothing that separated them from the intimacy they both craved. When they finally came together in the massive 4-poster bed, skin against skin, heartbeat against heartbeat, it was simultaneously familiar and entirely new. The girl who had stolen kisses in moonlit gardens 3 years ago had become a woman who understood loss and grief. The young duke who had gone to war full of confidence and idealism had returned scarred and haunted, but their love, that essential connection that had sustained them through separation and suffering, remained unchanged, a constant in a world of variables. Magnus was gentle, despite the desperation she could feel thrumming through him, his touch reverent as he mapped the curves of her body with hands that had been hardened by war, but remained tender with her. He kissed every inch of her skin he could reach, murmuring words of love and devotion that made her heart swell and her eyes burn with fresh tears. When he finally made her his wife in truth, Serafina clung to him, her nails digging into his shoulders, her body arching into his. The pleasure was intense, overwhelming, but what made her cry out was not merely the physical sensation, but the emotional weight of it, the knowledge that this was Magnus, her Magnus, alive and real and hers. That they had survived everything that had tried to separate them and found their way back to each other. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, the fire burning low in the grate, their breathing gradually slowing. Magnus held her close, one arm wrapped around her waist, his face buried in her hair. Serafina could feel the rapid beat of his heart against her back, could feel the tremor in his hands that suggested he was as overwhelmed by emotion as she was. "I dreamed of this," he murmured into the darkness, his voice rough. "In that prison, when the pain was worst, when I thought I couldn't endure another moment, I would close my eyes and imagine this, holding you, being with you, having the right to call you mine before God and man." Serafina turned in his arms so she could see his face. In the dim light from the dying fire, his features were softened, made younger. The hard edges that war had carved into him seemed less pronounced, as if being with her had allowed him to set down some of the armor he carried. "You have that right now," she said softly, reaching up to trace the scar along his jaw with gentle fingers. "I am yours, Magnus, Completely and irrevocably yours. Nothing and no one can separate us again." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, his eyes closing briefly. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me," he promised, "making sure you are happy, protected, loved beyond measure." "I could never regret it," Serafina assured him. "You are my choice, Magnus. Not the choice my father made for me, not the safe or convenient choice. You, always you." They made love again, slower this time, with less desperation and more tenderness. And then they slept, wrapped in each other's arms, both of them finally at peace for the first time in 3 years. Morning came with pale winter sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains, and Serafina woke to find herself draped across Magnus's chest, his arm around her, his breathing deep and even. She allowed herself a moment to simply observe him in sleep, the way his dark lashes rested against his cheeks, the slight softening of his features, the evidence that even in sleep he held her close. Then his eyes opened, and the grey depths focused on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment they simply looked at each other, taking in the reality of waking together, of being husband and wife, of having survived everything that had tried to destroy them. "Good morning, Duchess," Magnus said, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. "Good morning, husband," Serafina replied, and felt a smile spread across her face that was pure joy. They breakfasted in the ducal suite, neither wanting to face the world quite yet. Mrs. Patterson arranged for trays to be brought up, and they ate in their nightclothes, talking and laughing with an ease that felt miraculous after so much pain. But eventually, reality could no longer be avoided. "We need to address what happened last night," Magnus said as he finished his coffee. "Your father will not take this lying down, nor will Harrowmont. We should expect repercussions." Serafina's smile faded. "What sort of repercussions?" "Your father may attempt to have the marriage annulled, claiming I coerced you. Harrowmont may sue for breach of contract, though my evidence of the forged documents will make that difficult for him. And society—" Magnus paused, his expression grim. "Society will have opinions, strong ones. We've created the scandal of the decade." "I don't care about society's opinions," Serafina said firmly. "I care about you, about us. Let them gossip." "I admire your courage," Magnus said, reaching across to take her hand. "But you should know what you're facing. Some doors that were open to you as Lady Serafina Alderbury may close now that you're the Duchess of Thornridge, who eloped in the middle of a ball, breaking a formal betrothal mere weeks before the wedding." "Then those doors were not worth walking through," Serafina replied. "I would rather be shut out of society entirely than lose you again." Magnus's expression softened with love. "You won't lose me. Not ever. But I want you to understand the price we may pay for our happiness." As it transpired, the price was steep but bearable. By afternoon the house was besieged by callers, most of whom Henderson turned away with polite but firm refusals. The Earl of Eldamont arrived in a state of apoplectic rage, demanding to see his daughter. Magnus met him in the entrance hall rather than allowing him access to Serafina. "She is my daughter!" the Earl bellowed, his face purple with fury. "You have no right to keep her from me." "She is my wife," Magnus corrected coldly. "Legally married by special license from the Archbishop of Canterbury. Your rights as her father ended the moment she became my Duchess, and considering your actions, the forged documents, the fraudulent death notice, the systematic deception, you should count yourself fortunate that I'm not having you brought up on charges." "You cannot prove anything," the Earl blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "I can prove everything," Magnus replied, his tone glacial. "I have documentation, testimony from the War Office, letters bearing your seal. If you push me, Eldamont, I will ensure that every drawing room in London knows exactly what you did. I will destroy your reputation so thoroughly that you will not be received in any respectable home in England." The Earl paled. Social ruin was a fate worse than death for a man of his standing. "What do you want?" he asked finally, defeated. "I want you to leave my wife alone," Magnus said flatly. "I want you to accept that she is lost to you, that you forfeited any right to her love or loyalty when you lied to her about my death. I want you to withdraw quietly from society for a period, say a year, and when you return, I want you to do so with the understanding that if you ever attempt to contact Serafina without her explicit invitation, I will release all the evidence I have compiled." The Earl stared at him for a long moment, then nodded stiffly. "Very well." "One more thing," Magnus added, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You made my wife suffer. You stole 3 years from us. If I were a less civilized man, I would call you out for that. As it is, I am simply informing you that you are not welcome in this house now or ever. Serafina may choose to forgive you in time, but I will not. Stay away from her or face the consequences." The Earl left without another word, his shoulders bowed, looking suddenly old and diminished. Lord Cedric Harrowmont proved more difficult. He did attempt to sue for breach of contract, filing papers that claimed Magnus had coerced Serafina and that the marriage was therefore invalid. The case went before a judge, and the proceedings were the talk of London. Magnus's solicitor, Mr. Whitmore, proved masterful in court. He presented evidence of the forged death notice, testimony from War Office officials, and letters that proved the Earl had orchestrated the deception. He demonstrated that Serafina's betrothal to Lord Harrowmont had been predicated on false information, namely, that Magnus was dead and was therefore invalid from the start. The judge, after hearing all the evidence, ruled in Magnus's favour. The marriage stood, the breach of contract suit was dismissed, and Lord Harrowmont was left humiliated and financially poorer for his trouble. But it was the testimony Serafina herself gave that proved most devastating. Asked by the judge if she had been coerced into marrying the Duke of Thornridge, she looked directly at Cedric and spoke clearly. "I was not coerced. I married the Duke of Thornridge because I love him, because I have always loved him, and because I believed him dead based on fraudulent information. Had I known he was alive, I would never have agreed to marry Lord Harrowmont. My consent to that betrothal was obtained through deception, and therefore it was not true consent at all." The judgment reverberated through society. Opinion was divided. Some condemned Serafina as a faithless woman who had humiliated a respectable gentleman. Others praised her courage in following her heart and breaking free from a loveless match. The romantic element, a duke returning from the dead to reclaim his lost love, captured imaginations even among those who felt compelled to publicly tisk at the impropriety of it all. The Prince Regent himself, when informed of the situation, was said to have laughed heartily and declared it the most entertaining drama the season has produced. His approval, however grudging and private, went a long way toward rehabilitating the Thornridges in society's eyes. Through it all, Magnus and Serafina remained largely sequestered in the Berkeley Square townhouse, emerging only for essential business and ignoring the gossip. They had each other, and that was sufficient. 6 months later, they hosted their first ball as a married couple. It was in many ways a test, a way to gauge whether society would accept them back into the fold or whether they would be permanently ostracized. The invitations went out to every person of consequence in London, and the responses trickled back slowly. Some refusals were expected. Families aligned with the Eldermonts or the Harrowmonts would naturally decline. But to Serafina's surprise and relief, most of the responses were acceptances. Curiosity, if nothing else, would bring the ton to their door. The night of the ball, Serafina stood in the master bedroom, being dressed by Martha, who had resigned from the Earl's household and come to work for the Duchess of Thornridge. The gown was exquisite, deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue in her eyes, cut in the latest fashion with a bodice that was daringly low, but still appropriate. "You look beautiful, Your Grace," Martha said with satisfaction, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "I look nervous," Serafina corrected, her hands twisting together. "That too," Martha agreed with a small smile. "But His Grace won't let anything happen to you. That man would fight the devil himself if it meant keeping you safe." It was true. In the 6 months since their marriage, Magnus had been unfailingly protective, supportive, and loving. The nightmares that plagued him were slowly diminishing. The anger that sometimes flared had found healthier outlets in estate management and in work with veterans' charities he had established. He was healing, gradually, and she was healing with him. Magnus himself entered the bedroom at that moment, resplendent in formal evening wear that emphasized his broad shoulders and military bearing. He had filled out somewhat since his return, no longer quite so lean and haunted-looking. The scars remained, but they had faded to silver lines that told stories of survival rather than suffering. "You are breathtaking," he said simply, crossing to her and taking her hands. "Every man in that ballroom tonight will envy me." "And every woman will envy me," Serafina replied, reaching up to straighten his cravat. "We are quite the handsome couple." "We are quite the scandalous couple," Magnus corrected with a wry smile. "But I find I don't care." "Do you?" "Not even a little," Serafina assured him. "Let them talk. We know the truth of what we are to each other." The ballroom at Thornridge House had been transformed into a glittering wonderland of candlelight and flowers. The orchestra was the finest money could hire, and the refreshments were lavish enough to impress even the most jaded palate. As guests began to arrive, Serafina and Magnus stood together at the entrance to receive them, presenting a united front. The first few arrivals were friends, people who had supported them from the beginning. But then came the test. The Duchess of Ravencroft, whose ball they had fled from 6 months ago, swept in with her usual imperious bearing. Serafina held her breath, unsure what reception they would receive from this formidable woman. The Duchess looked them both up and down, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Then, to Serafina's shock, she smiled. "Your Graces," she said warmly, "thank you for the invitation. I must say the ball you disrupted was already the event of the season, before you made your dramatic exit. But this," she gestured around the beautifully decorated ballroom, "this promises to be even better. I do hope you'll lead the first waltz. It will set just the right tone." And just like that the tide turned. If the Duchess of Ravencroft approved, others would follow, and they did. The ballroom filled with lords and ladies, politicians and military men, dowagers and debutantes. Some came out of genuine affection, others came out of curiosity. But they came, and by their presence they signaled acceptance. When Magnus led Serafina onto the dance floor for the first waltz, the assembled crowd watched with rapt attention. This was the couple who had defied convention, who had chosen love over propriety, who had survived separation and scandal to be together. Their story had captured London's imagination, and watching them waltz, the way Magnus looked at his wife as if she were the only person in the world, the way Serafina smiled up at him with unguarded joy, it was impossible not to be moved. "We did it," Serafina murmured as they turned in perfect synchrony. "We survived." "We did more than survive," Magnus corrected, pulling her infinitesimally closer, testing the boundaries of propriety. "We triumphed. You are my wife, I am your husband, and we have the rest of our lives to be scandalous together." Serafina laughed, the sound bright and free. "Only you would consider being scandalous a life goal." "I have very simple ambitions," Magnus replied. "To love you, to protect you, to make you happy. And if society occasionally gets its collective nose out of joint in the process, well, that's merely an entertaining side benefit." As they danced, Serafina looked around the ballroom, at the faces watching them, at the glittering assembly, at the life she had built from the ashes of grief. 6 months ago, she had been engaged to a man she didn't love, resigned to a future of comfortable emptiness, merely an entertaining side benefit. As they danced, Serafina looked around the ballroom, at the faces watching them, at the glittering assembly, at the life she had built from the ashes of grief. 6 months ago, she had been engaged to a man she didn't love, resigned to a future of comfortable emptiness. Now she was the Duchess of Thornridge, married to the man who held her heart, and embarking on a future that promised not comfort, but passion, not emptiness, but fullness. Yes, there had been scandal. Yes, there had been consequences. But as Magnus spun her across the dance floor, his grey eyes warm with love and his hand steady at her waist, Serafina couldn't bring herself to regret a single moment. She had waited for him. He had come back to her. And they had fought for their love against every obstacle that tried to separate them. That, she thought, was a far better story than any the gossips could tell. Epilogue. 2 years later. The gardens at Thornridge Hall were in full bloom, summer asserting itself with luxuriant abundance. Roses climbed the ancient stone walls, their perfume heavy in the warm air. Butterflies danced among the hollyhocks and delphiniums. Bees droned industriously from flower to flower, and in the shade of the old oak trees, in the very grove where Magnus had said goodbye to Serafina 5 years ago, a blanket had been spread on the grass. Serafina sat on that blanket, her back against the trunk of the largest oak, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their second child grew. Beside her, their daughter, 14-month-old Catherine Margaret de Thornridge, named for both their mothers, attempted to catch butterflies with chubby, uncoordinated hands, giggling each time one eluded her grasp. Magnus lay stretched out on the blanket, his head in Serafina's lap, his eyes closed against the dappled sunlight. He looked peaceful in a way that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. The nightmares came rarely now. The anger had been largely replaced by contentment. The scars remained, but they were simply part of him, a map of survival, not a catalogue of suffering. "She has your determination," Magnus observed without opening his eyes, as Catherine tumbled over in pursuit of a particularly beautiful monarch butterfly, picked herself up without complaint, and continued her chase. "She has your stubbornness," Serafina corrected, running her fingers through his hair in a gesture that had become habitual. "When she wants something, she doesn't give up." "That is determination, not stubbornness." "It's both." Magnus opened one eye to look up at her, a smile playing at his lips. "Are we arguing?" "We're discussing," Serafina replied primly, then couldn't help but laugh at his skeptical expression. "All right, we're arguing, but it's a very civilized argument. The best kind." He reached up to take her free hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I love arguing with you. I love everything about our life together. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real." "I know what you mean," Serafina admitted, watching Catherine finally catch a flower instead of a butterfly and examine it with intense concentration. "Sometimes I wake up and have to remind myself that you're really here, that we're really married, that this life we're living isn't a dream I'll be woken from." Magnus sat up then, shifting so he could look at her properly. His hand came to rest on her belly, feeling the flutter of movement from the child within. "This is very real," he said softly. "You are real. Catherine is real. This baby is real. Our love is real. And I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never doubt it." Serafina leaned forward to kiss him, a gentle press of lips that conveyed love and trust and bone-deep contentment. When they separated, she rested her forehead against his. "We've come a long way from that winter night when you walked into the Duchess of Ravencroft's ballroom." "The best decision I ever made," Magnus said firmly. "Well, the second best. The best was falling in love with you in the first place." "And the third best?" Serafina teased, "surviving long enough to come back and fight for you." It wasn't really a jest, Serafina realized. Magnus was serious. Everything he had endured, the war, the capture, the torture, the escape, he framed as necessary trials he had overcome to reach this moment, to reach her, to reach this life. "I'm glad you did," she said simply. "Fight for me, I mean. Fight for us." "I always will," Magnus promised. "No matter what comes, Serafina, I will always fight for us." Catherine toddled over then, her flower clutched triumphantly in one fist, dirt smudged on her nose, and a smile of pure joy on her face. She climbed into Magnus's lap, with the supreme confidence of a child who knew herself beloved, and presented her flower to her mother. "For Mama," she announced, the words still slightly garbled, but perfectly understandable. "Thank you, darling," Serafina said, taking the somewhat crushed flower with appropriate reverence. "It's beautiful." Catherine beamed, then settled contentedly against her father's chest, her thumb finding its way to her mouth, her eyes already beginning to droop with the sudden onset of toddler exhaustion. Magnus wrapped his arms around his daughter, pressing a kiss to her dark curls, and looked at Serafina with an expression of such profound happiness that it made her throat tight with emotion. This was what they had fought for. Not just the right to be together, but these quiet moments of domestic bliss, this simple joy of being a family, this peaceful afternoon in a sunlit garden with their child, and another on the way. This was the life they had been denied for 3 years, The life her father had tried to steal, the life they had seized back through courage and love and sheer stubborn determination. In the distance, Serafina could hear the sounds of the estate, servants going about their work, horses in the stable, the rhythms of a household running smoothly. This was her home now, in a way her father's house had never been. Here, she was not merely the Earl's daughter, or even the Duke's wife. Here she was herself, loved for who she was, not for what she represented or what alliances she could forge. "What are you thinking?" Magnus asked softly, careful not to disturb Catherine, who was nearly asleep. "I'm thinking that I'm happy," Serafina replied. "Truly, deeply, completely happy. And I'm thinking that everything we went through, all the pain, all the loss, all the struggle, was worth it to arrive here, at this moment." Magnus's smile was tender. "I was thinking the same thing." They sat like that as the afternoon waned into evening, as Catherine slept in her father's arms, and the baby moved gently in Serafina's womb as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple. They sat together, a family forged by adversity and tempered by love, and they were content. The gossips of London still occasionally spoke of the scandalous Duke and Duchess of Thornridge, who had created the most dramatic scene in memory when they eloped from the Duchess of Ravencroft's ball. But the tone of those discussions had shifted. What had once been shock and censure had become admiration and even envy. In a world of arranged marriages and loveless matches made for property and position, the Thornridges represented something rare and precious. They had chosen each other, fought for each other, and built a marriage based on genuine love. They were, in their way, a living fairy tale. And if the path to their happy ending had been darker and more difficult than most fairy tales allowed, well, that only made the happiness more precious, the ending more earned. As stars began to appear in the deepening sky, Magnus carefully stood with Catherine in his arms. "We should go inside," he said quietly. "She needs to be put to bed properly, and you need rest as well." Serafina allowed him to help her to her feet. The pregnancy was far enough along that Grace was becoming difficult, and they walked back toward the great house together, Catherine sleeping peacefully in her father's arms, the promise of their growing family carried beneath Serafina's heart. Behind them, the garden settled into evening quiet, the roses folding their petals against the cooling air, the butterflies finding places to rest. And in the grove where Magnus had once said goodbye, believing he might never return, where Serafina had stood years later and wept for a love she thought lost forever, peace reigned. The past could not be changed. The 3 years they had lost could never be recovered. But the future stretched before them, bright with possibility and rich with love. And that, both Magnus and Serafina agreed, was more than enough. It was everything. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 2,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, Echoes of Romance.